Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, I'm your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Burtram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing great. Thanks, Will.
Hey, and we have with us returning Jerome Copulsky. He's a research fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. And I should just point out that we just learned that it is not the same Berkeley as UC Berkeley. So for any of you people that were thinking that it was connected, shame on you. I knew the real answer all along. I knew that it was located in Georgetown University. But Jerome is also the author of American Heretics, Religious Adversaries of Liberal Order, which is a groundbreaking exploration of religious critiques of America's political foundations and the challenges they pose to liberal democracy. So welcome back to the show, Jerome.
Well, good to see you guys.
Yeah. So the last time we had you on, you were talking to us about uncivil religion. And now you wrote a book about religion, and I'd love for you just to kind of just tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, well, this is the project on civil religion was about January 6, 2001, and the religious dimensions of the riot at the Capitol. American Heretics is about a very different set of religious figures and thinkers going back to the American Revolution and up to today. And the theme of the book is religious thinkers who rejected the American founding in some because of their theological views, that they saw the founding as not being aligned with Christianity as they understood it, and many of them provide an alternative vision of what the American political project ought to look like.
So if I'm understanding you, these were key religious figures during the time of the founding that were pushing back on the notion that America was supposed to be a Christian nation.
Yeah, I guess a way of framing the book is, we have a conversation in sort of American life today, going back several decades, about what did the founders intend? Like what kind of state, what kind of nation was the United States intended to be? And on one side, religious conservatives tend to argue that the United States was really founded as a Christian nation in some way. That the founders were Christian. That the Declaration of Independence made several references to the deity. That there was a First Amendment which did not establish a particular church, but that did not mean the separation of religion from political life, as evidenced by the fact that there were chaplains in Congress and in the military. National days of prayer and Thanksgiving, prayers in school, Bible reading in school, and things like that. And it was really not until the 1940s and 50s that this regime of secularism changed that, so took down this unofficial pan-Protestant establishment. And there's another view, the secularist view, which argues that the founders actually established a modern Enlightenment secular regime, although secular would not be the term that the founders would use, and that the Constitution's First Amendment was explicitly put in to not have an establishment of religion as pertained in, say, Great Britain or throughout Europe, that the free exercise of religion meant that the state did not have jurisdiction over people's religious lives. And that this, in many ways, might have been honored in the breach throughout American history, but the real intention was a break from the notion of Christendom, the kind of Christian nations that existed in Europe prior to the American Revolution. And what American Heretics tries to do is look at a third tradition of thinking about the American founding and the American political project. And these were religious thinkers who agreed with the secularists that the United States was not founded as a Christian nation, as they understood a Christian nation to be, and that this was a mistake, right? And that the problems that the United States has faced and endured since the founding, in many ways, could be sort of track down to this original failure of properly constitutionalizing religion in the American Republic. So I begin during the American Revolution looking at Church of England loyalists who opposed the Patriot Project and were writing in their pamphlets and in their sermons against the wrong ideas that were being proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence, right? The idea that human beings come together to form a social human beings are endowed with natural rights. They come together to form a social compact to protect these natural rights. The Church of England loyalists have rejected this view in their commitment to the King of England, but also in their commitment to a cosmic order, which they felt that the Loyalist Project was also in rebellion against. And I track this idea of a problematic founding through the early Republic, the pre-Civil War period, and up until today's post-liberals and national conservatives.
Are most of the critiques like grounded on theology, or are there arguments being made that are secular type of arguments?
Well, I think they're mostly coming from theological commitments, although one could say that sometimes when they're making their arguments, they will make a functional claim about religion, that like states need an establishment for stability and security and whatnot. But they're often based on the theological claim about the nature of the divine, the nature of creation, the nature of human beings, and the role of the nature of the state, of what political authority is, and the role of the state in cultivating virtue, in promoting the true church, and orienting its subjects to a common good, or indeed their final good. And we'll see, the theology is different. Like the Church of England theology is different from the theology of the Reformed Presbyterians, which was very different from the theology of the Southern pro-slavery Presbyterians. And we could look at the theological differences of conservative Catholics or Christian Reconstructionists and so on. What they all have in common is the fact that they look back at what I would call, what we might call the project of liberal democracy, and see that as fundamentally at odds with their understanding of Christian faith and Christian theology.
So what were the arguments that they kind of leveled at the idea that of this democracy? Like why was it such a perversion of the order that they thought should be, this third way that they thought should be practiced and espoused and enshrined in America? What were the arguments that they made against democracy? Why was it such an issue to these thinkers?
Yeah, so I can give a couple of different examples. I mean, if we start with the Church of England, the argument of democracy is that they actually believed in sort of a natural hierarchy of beings, and they believed that certain people were born as kings and certain people were born as subjects. And so the idea of democracy, the idea of equality, I should say, because democracy sort of emerges as a political sort of system emerges later, but this idea of natural equality, the idea that people come and join us, that states are formed by social contract, right, by agreement, by consent, is a rejection of what they understood to be the divine order, right? This great chain of being. Now, if we move into after the American Revolution into the period of the American Constitution, the Reformed Presbyterians or Covenanters were a small, very traditional Calvinist sect with roots back in 16th and 17th century Scotland. They supported the American Revolution. They were opposed to the Church of England. They were opposed to the relationship of church and state that England held. But they rejected the Constitution because they believed that the Constitution did not install a properly Christian regime. So they looked at the Constitution, and unlike the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution does not make any mention of God, does not acknowledge God, doesn't acknowledge the rulership of Jesus. It doesn't acknowledge the Bible as the source of law. it, in fact, in Article 6, Section 3, forbids a religious test for federal office, right? So this means that someone who's a non-Christian, who's an infidel, right, could become a magistrate, indeed could become the president of the country. They looked at the First Amendment, and they saw not only not an establishment of religion, but the protection of the free exercise of religion really meant the free exercise of false religion, right? So the state had given up its role to protect the true church and promote the true faith. And they also were early abolitionists. They believed that slavery was immoral. So they looked at all of this. They looked at the American Constitution, and they thought, this is an infidel regime, right? And their response to it was essentially to be conscientious objectors, like not participate as much as possible. So they would not run for office, they wouldn't vote, they wouldn't serve on juries, they tried to stay out of the militias. They paid their taxes because they felt that they really didn't have a choice. They were otherwise law-abiding, but they would not participate politically until such a time as the state sort of changed its ways and became a truly Christian polity. So their argument was not so much against democracy. They actually, during the War of 1812, in which they supported the United States against Great Britain, even though they did not consider themselves full citizens, they argued that the idea of representative democracy, as it was played out in the mechanism of the Constitution, was completely legitimate. So all the Covenanters wanted was essentially to rewrite the preamble of the Constitution to align it with their theology. But of course, that would mean taking out Article 6, Section 3, and taking out the First Amendment, right? So we can see that as their theological critique of the American project, but also the ways in which they understood that they could enter into or accept the American system at some time in the future. And in fact, they became the leading edge of a movement for a Christian amendment, both during the Civil War and immediately afterwards.
That's pretty wild. So like I think I might have been confused. So like these are people that basically were telling the founders, like, you're not Christian nationing hard enough, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
like you're close, but you're not necessarily creating the theocratic, system that we want for you to create. Did I get that right?
Yeah, precisely. And what's funny is that even within this small denomination, the Reformed Presbyterians, there becomes a kind of a shift in its members. That in the 1820s and 1830s, there were members, and remember, they're not participating, right? They're not voting. They're not, they won't even at this point, they won't vote for people who would support a Christian amendment. Because they felt that by voting, they're still participating in an illegitimate system, right? So they're pretty hard line. And then they begin to kind of squint and see, well, maybe it's Christian enough, right? Maybe there's still, the federal Constitution may not acknowledge God, but there are certain kinds of acknowledgments of religion on the state level. Some of in some ways it becomes good enough. And the denomination itself splits over this issue in 1833 into a sort of a hardline faction that holds this tradition, this idea of this testimony of political dissent, as they called it, and the New Light faction, this new view, which is like, well, it's not perfect, but it's good enough. We can work within it. It's legit. It has enough legitimacy for us to participate.
Interesting. So would it be fair to compare, these critics of kind of America's founding with, say some of the work that family, the FRC does, the Family Research Council, or like the Center for Renewing America, like these, or ADF, Alliance for Defending Freedom, like all these organizations that have done things that are trying to, make Christianity like the country's main religion. So, like, would that be a fair comparison, you think?
Yeah, I think where I'd like to what I try to do, and I try to show in sort of the latter chapters of the book, is that there's a tradition in American sort of religious politics to essentially, which is essentially sees itself as restorationist, right? That the system was a Christian system as they understood it. Things began to change in the 40s and 50s for a number of complicated reasons, but these Supreme Court decisions of sort of stipulating that there's a separation of church and state, of removing prayer from the schools, removing Bible reading from the schools, and then things that decisions about birth control and abortion and the rights of gays and lesbians in America, right? All of this had sort of shifted the ground from what was seen as a Christian America to a radically secular America. So the idea is really to restore what had been the case. The people that I'm writing about actually were like, it was never really the case. It was never adequate, never truly a Christian nation. What's needed is not sort of rolling back the Supreme Court decisions prior to 1947 and the Everson case, but really putting something new in the Constitution to say affirmatively that America is a Christian nation. And so, if you look at the chapter I write about the sort of the religious right that emerges in the 1970s and the 80s under the banner of people like Jerry Falwell and Paul Robertson, that's kind of their position. And pushing back against that are people like R.J. Rushdoony and Gary North, who are essentially saying, well, that's not enough. Right? Going back to the status quo ante is not really what we want. What we want is a more thoroughgoing understanding of a Christian politics. In the case of Rushdoony and North, it would be the implementation of biblical law. But if you look at someone like Albert Bozell Jr., it would be sort of making America into a Catholic state, and similar to what Spain was doing under Franco. So again, these guys are much more radical than what we call the garden variety religious right. Even though people like Falwell and Pat Robertson and Francis Schaeffer were reading people like Rushdoony and in sense influenced by their positions.
So I just want to take a step back for a moment and help me and help the audience understand what is kind of the main argument of the book. What are you trying to accomplish with it? What do you want us to understand, like the problem or the issue that you're trying to bring before us to think about, to consider, to wonder, to talk about? What would you say? What's the main argument of the book?
I'd say the main argument of the book is from the very beginning, from the time of the American Revolution. There have been religious voices and sophisticated religious voices who rejected the kind of state, the kind of political order that was coming to be in the United States, that were rejecting the ideas of liberty, of equality, rejecting the reality of religious pluralism. And they were rejecting these things based on their understanding of the Christian religion. And they were imagining what an alternate America would look like. And so that, today when we're looking at post-liberal thinkers or national conservative thinkers, we're looking at these religious actors that seem to be rejecting liberal democracy for some other political alternative. That they are not, this is not novel, this is not new, but this is part of this longer tradition of discontent with an American political project that they feel is insufficiently religious, and in fact does not allow them to live out religion in under their terms. So, and again, to go back to that sort of original dichotomy between sort of this idea of like sort of religious America and secular America, I'm trying to show that, in fact, that story is more complicated when we look at this tradition of thinkers.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I'd love for you to maybe break down, like, what are some of the, key desires or temptations of, like, religious liberalism, that you explore in the book, and why do you think, it just remains this, like, perennial challenge for our democracy? And maybe before you answer that, talk about, like when we're talking about liberal illiberalism, maybe kind of just define those terms so people don't think it's not like, liberal conservative or whatever.
Yeah, so one of the things I try to do in this book is not to make sort of strong claims about what the founding is, what liberalism is. I'm essentially trying to explicate how these thinkers understand the world that they live in, understand the ideologies that they're pushing up against. I think we could kind of look at least three elements of liberalism as it emerges in the United States that these thinkers don't like. One is the idea of liberty itself, the idea that human beings are free to essentially understand who they are and what their own good is. That this idea of human freedom that is outside of, or at least pushing against the constraints of, an authoritative tradition. That makes them very uncomfortable. Two, the idea of equality, political equality, that many of the people that I'm looking at in this book sort of believe in hierarchies, believe in natural, sort of ordained hierarchies of people. And that could be, the hierarchy that we described in the Church of England, which, starts with the king and goes all the way down to the commoner, sort of, the metropole to the colonies. But it could also be the hierarchy that was being proclaimed and defended by the Southern pro-slavery theologians, right? The hierarchy between the master and the slave. And hierarchies not only of race but also of gender. And the third is the idea of pluralism, the idea that we live in a world where people have very different religious views, live in different religious communities, have different understandings of the good, have different understandings of what how they ought to live in the world. The people that I look at see pluralism as not something to be celebrated, but as a problem, as a sign of a sort of a fallen order that needs to be corrected. So there are different levels of toleration that the different figures that I look at would be willing to endorse, but at the very best, it would be toleration. It wouldn't be religious freedom, right? This idea that the state has nothing to do, that the state is not sort of either protecting or supporting a church or engaged in policies that will lead you to the right kind of religious behavior, right? They think that's a problem.
So we've been talking about, you threw a couple names out there, Rushdoony, Gary North, right? So it's interesting because I actually years and years and years ago, I downloaded a bunch of like Gary North books. They're like free PDFs. They're like 600 pages long, like commentaries. And then I'm looking through and I start reading and like see like some of the stuff, if I remember correctly, like, yeah, we should reinstitute public executions. I remember in one, and I was just like, whoa, like this is really intense. And I didn't ever quite get through it because I don't know, I just got interested in other stuff. And I'm not even sure how I heard about him. It was some kind of rabbit trail, right? Google rabbit trail, and then finally found him. I was listening to a lot of super conservative guys, and I think probably in the rabbit trail I found Gary North. I would love for you to kind of talk about like what are they actually proposing? So I get that they're saying, hey, it's not enough to go back. We need to restart. But what would that actually look like? And how concerned should we be about them, these voices? I don't know, like, are they mainstream? Are they marginal voices? like how concerned should we be that Trump and when he runs for his third term in 2028 or tries to declare himself king or whatever it is, how concerned should we be about Gary North or Rushdoony, or I don't even know if Rushdoony's still alive, but or either of them are still alive, but if they would be on like the council, or one of his advisors or something like that. What do you think?
I have a complicated answer. So Gary North died a couple of years ago. Rushdoony died in the 2000 aughts.
Rest in peace.
Yeah, and they were the architects of something called Christian Reconstruction, and really the best sort of primer on this is a book by Michael McVicker on a super great intellectual biography of Rushdoony. And essentially, what Rushdoony comes out of the Presbyterian tradition. He's an arch Calvinist, and he he's trying to kind of make sense of modern America and the secularization of the 50s and 60s, and he believes that the law of the Bible, the biblical law, the law of Moses, was not superseded with Christ. That the laws that are detailed in Exodus and Numbers and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, they're still binding on humanity, except for the ones that were explicitly sort of removed by Jesus. But the rest of them are still binding, and that is the law that human beings ought to live under. He believed that the modern state was a pagan institution, and he had a kind of, we'll call it a spiritual libertarianism. He believed that there was particular spheres of authority, the sphere of the household, the sphere of the church, and the sphere of the state. And the sphere of the state was really just kind of mutual defense, kind of, sort of holding, providing sort of the guardrails of the society. But most stuff is going to occur at the level of the household and the church. So he was not a big state guy. He actually wanted a radical devolution of authority down. But he believed that those laws that had been sort of legislated by Moses were the laws that a society ought to live by, ought to implement and live by. Now, he didn't think that this was going to happen anytime soon or quickly. He also, and this is an important point to make, he was a postmillennialist, which means that he didn't, he did not believe that Jesus was going to come soon, wipe everything away, and sort of institute the millennium. He believed that after Jesus' death, it instituted a new time came in, and that Christians were meant to essentially build up a Christian society. And at the end of that millennium, Christ would return. So the role of a believing Christian was to essentially work to establish this kind of Christian society, and it may take hundreds of years or 1,000 years, but that was the charge. And in this, he stood in a certain tension with the evangelicals of his time, people like Falwell and Robertson, who were premillennialists, right? Who believed that this world is doomed, that the apocalypse will happen, and then things will be sorted out by Jesus. What this meant was it made sense. Christian politics made sense. It was the charge of human beings, of Christians, to exert dominion over the world, right? To make the world more Christian. And his understanding, and later Gary North, who was his first major disciple, his son-in-law, and then Gary North essentially breaks and starts his own Christian Reconstructionist movement. The Bible was the blueprint of this new Christian society that would be reconstructed. So they were in the 70s and 80s, they were working with people in the new religious right, even though they differed with them on these theological issues. They were working with them particularly in legal cases regarding homeschooling and Christian academies, because they believed that government schools were illegitimate. Right? Government schools were the established church of the United States that were sort of teaching this religion of paganism that they needed to fight back against. But you can hear this idea of taking dominion, this idea of a politicized Christianity gets taken up into other currents in American religion, and indeed world religion. So if you go and you listen to certain preachers in the charismatic or Pentecostalist tradition, particularly those associated with the New Apostolic Reformation, right? You hear this idea of the Seven Mountains Mandate, right? And the idea of taking dominion, right? That's taking a lot of the language from these reconstructionists and bringing it into their tradition. You also hear this kind of language and influence in people like Doug Wilson, right? And sort of what's going on in places like Moscow, Idaho. These theobros to a certain extent, who see their religion as not as something that takes place not only within the church, but should take dominion, take control over swaths of society, whether it's sort of the economic life, political life, other spheres of human endeavor. So, I don't know how many, Christian reconstructionists of the Rushduni or Gary North type are still active today, but their ideas are certainly active in the charismatic movement and also in these kind of neo-Calvinist churches.
Yeah, I
So,
definitely. Go ahead, Josh.
Sorry. Oh, yeah, I was just thinking, I just want to make sure I wrap my head around it. That's all. So you have Rushduni, who then discipled Gary North. Both these guys influenced major evangelical voices in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And then, obviously if they influenced Doug Wilson, he's become a fairly large evangelical voice, or whatever you want to call him. I don't know, but a large Christian voice in that particular kind of Christianity of, hey, we need a Christian society. And so the vision is, if they get in power, the vision is what? Get rid of the Constitution and rewrite the Constitution, or give a different, just completely scrap it. Just, hey, the Bible is our Constitution. What, what is the vision that's being? I understand it's a Christian nation, but what kind of Christian nation? I guess, what would that even look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. Gary North. There's this big argument that Gary North and Rushduni have in the '80s about the Constitution. And Gary North, you mentioned, he wrote like a book a year, and each of these books were like 600, 700 pages, right? He was a prolific guy, and then he puts it all up on his website for free. He wrote a book called Political Polytheism. I think it comes out in '88, and he is arguing against Christian conservatives who are lining up behind this idea of originalism. Right, so the legal theory, the jurisprudential theory that if we just interpret the Constitution according to the intent of the founders, right, or its original public meaning, or however we want to understand what originalism is, that will clean up the excesses of the Supreme Court, of the court since the 40s and 50s. Right, we have to get back to this this jurisprudence of original intent, right? And Gary North kind of looks at that. Well, for Rushduni looks at that and goes, well, that won't be enough, because unless what really needs to happen is not that we have to clean up the Constitution, but people have to come to the right religion. And that's not just Christianity, but it's a certain kind of Christianity. Because Rushduni is very critical of premillennial dispensationalists, of a kind of pietism, of kind of a Christianity that is afraid to exert itself in the world, right? That's what he's opposed to. So for Rushduni, we can talk about originalism, but that's not going to solve the problem. What America really needs is a great awakening, more people coming to the true religion, more people coming to his understanding of Christianity. North goes a little bit further. North, at this point, had broken with Rushduni, so he was eager to find another place to differ with his former mentor. And he argues that the Constitution was drafted as an anti-Christian document. He believes that it emerged due to a Masonic conspiracy in Philadelphia. And the whole purpose of the Constitution was essentially to, over time, suppress true Christianity. So,
Wow.
so in political polytheism, he says, what do Christians need to do? Well, one of the things we need to do is rewrite the Constitution. And he actually sort of provides what he thinks the preamble of the Constitution ought to be. And of course, this would mean, if this were put into place, it would mean removing the protections of religious liberty that Americans have enjoyed since the founding, since 1787. So one of the things that's interesting that I found in that book is, the book is mostly, focused on his his adversaries that are close by, people like Rushdoony. I could mention Francis Schaeffer, who was in many ways an intellectual conduit from Rushdoony and north to people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
But there's his book, A Christian Manifesto, which Schaeffer published, I think, in the early 80s in 1982, was in many ways taking Rushdoony's ideas and transforming them to this more popular idiom.
I think I have that book, Jerome. I think I have that book.
All right, so
I found that in my wife's grandpa's. He gave it to me.
And Rushdoony complained that he was essentially taking his ideas but not properly attributing them to him. So North publishes this book, and he dedicates it to the Reformed Presbyterians, the Covenanters, right? Those original conservative Scotch Presbyterians who rejected the Constitution because they felt that it was an infidel document.
I have to ask, like to what end were a lot of these, critics, what was in it for them, essentially? Much in the same way of today when we look at Oklahoma, and Ryan Walters, and he's trying to do all these things and basically make Oklahoma like the first Christian state. An outsider like myself who lives in Virginia could say, oh, that's probably just a power grab. They're using religion to kind of get people to vote and do certain things that they want them to do. But back then, what was the end goal?
Well, I think there were different motivations depending on which people we're talking about. So, obviously the Church of England loyalists were interested in preserving their position in American society, right? They were interested, they supported not only the Church of England, but also the British imperial order, and that essentially they were functionaries of. And I should also say that within the Church of England in the American colonies, there was a difference of opinion about the notion of establishment, about the American Revolution itself. So as we know, many of the people who were participating in and who were leaders of the American Revolution were officially members of the Church of England, Jefferson and George Washington and so forth. The first prayer that was given at the Continental Congress was given by a Church of England clergyman named Jacob Duché out of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. So some of this was a way of sort of protecting one's own position. Certainly, what the Southern pro-slavery theologians were doing was trying to provide a theological, biblical justification for the order of slavery, right? That their society had been built upon. But if we look at other people like the Covenanters, or if we look at say the Catholic integralists, that they are imagining a counter society, right? L. Brent Bozell and the people who are writing for his Triumph magazine in the late 1960s are looking at a liberal America that they felt has failed. Right? They're looking at Vietnam War, they're looking at the student protests, they're looking at the urban riots, they're looking at feminism, they're looking at the public acceptance of homosexuality and abortion, and they see this as a society, as a culture that has failed. And they see they argue that the reason these things are happening is because people have become unmoored from the truth, with a capital T. So Bozell's critique is of the American founding, it's of the Declaration and the Constitution, but it's also a critique of modernity, of sort of the Enlightenment, of the Reformation. It's a critique of human thinking that is broken from his understanding what human nature is and how human nature ought to be sort of guided by political order. So what did he want? He wanted a polity, he wanted a society, he wanted a culture which was in line with truth as he understood it, and Christian revelation as articulated through the Catholic Church. That's what he wanted. And Rushdoony, and Gary North, instead of the Roman Catholic Church, it was their understanding of biblical law, and so on.
So I'm trying to, again, wrap my head around all this. It's absolutely like mind blowing, because it's like, on one hand, you get a lot of fear sometimes, I feel like, from the left about, hey, these guys are trying to take over. They're trying to make this a Christian nation. And a lot of people I talk to, they're like, well, yeah, I mean, if by Christian nation, you mean, one with some Christian morals, and, that a lot of people are Christian in it, or that, they don't really see anything wrong with that. We're still global players. We still want to allow people of different religions in here and all that. And so you have like this one, like, I don't want to call it a caricature, but this kind of persona of this kind of far right, religious right thinkers like Jerry Falwell, like Francis Schaeffer, which, I was influenced deeply by his book, How Then Shall We Live, right? That was different than his Christian manifesto. And I didn't realize kind of how tied in he was to the political part of all of this. I remember watching this really old video that he was in. He's talking about the foundations of Western society and all that. In
his lederhosen, right? Walking around the art museums in Italy.
Yeah. And he started, this place in Switzerland that like Brie, and it's like, that looks awesome to go and like, explore all these different things in the freaking Swiss Alps. I'm like, that's amazing. But all that to say, like, you have this persona of this right, but then it's like, what we're talking about here is like right. Like, it's not, let's get back to the Constitution. It's not, hey, let's restore something from America, right? That's from America's past, right? It's not MAGA. It's not make America great again. It's America was never great. We need to completely reestablish. We need to get rid of, abrogate and get rid of all these different, customs and laws that we've had. And we need to bring in a truly theocratic vision of America, right? And I'm thinking about the liberal democracy that we have, right? Some people, we got a little bit of heat from another episode because one of our guests said, well, we never had a democracy. And Will and I were to kind of talking a little bit, maybe he meant like a republic and, kind of a constitutional republic. I know a lot of guys talk about that. Oh, it's not really a democracy. It's a constitutional representative or, republic or whatever. And it's like, but we have this democracy. And one of the themes that you tackle is this sense of the fragility of this democracy in these values. I would love for you to dig into what are these values that you feel in particular. I hear pluralism, but even if there's sub values under that, or concepts within that, big umbrella term of liberalism and pluralism, what are those things that we hold dear that you feel like are under threat by this kind of rhetoric and thinking? And it's not just rhetoric, though. It's like, it's a different vision completely different vision of American life. What would you say?
So, to start off, you mentioned Schaeffer, and Schaeffer is a complicated story because he actually he's not really involved in politics until the mid-70s, when his son Frankie kind of drags him into American politics because of the abortion issue. And Schaeffer is really extremely important in making abortion into a Protestant issue, right? And so he enters into American politics. He hadn't lived in America since the 50s. Really, been as you mentioned, Bree running this kind of Christian retreat, and he writes a Christian manifesto. As I mentioned, Rushdoony complained that he wasn't adequately cited there, but North and Gary DeMarc complained even more deeply that he didn't have the courage of his convictions, because if he were truly following the thinking of Rushdoony and the Reconstructionists, he wouldn't end on, well, we need to restore, the American constitutional republic prior to the secularization. He would realize that what you need to do is establish a theocracy. And Schaeffer wasn't, in a Christian manifesto, Schaeffer's not calling for a theocratic order. He's calling for, I kind of want it to be like before the 1950s, right? He's still willing to have, Catholics and Jews participate, even though he thinks that the American project was really a Reformation project. Now, if we go, to the Fragility today, I mean, I spend some time watching, listening to, or reading the Theo Bros, and sort of their online posturing. And one of the things I've seen over and over again is the complaint about providing the franchise to women, right? And that how we should sort of repeal that amendment. This is, I think, American democracy didn't just come into being in 1776 or 1783 or 1787. It's been a long process of what I would call a representative democracy. We don't have a pure democracy, but we have a representative democracy, and we have a fairly universal suffrage. And that's been a slow, complicated, painful process to achieve, but America has achieved something close to universal suffrage. These people think that's the problem. The problem is, the problem is that too many people and too many of the wrong people are participating in politics, right? If you believe that you already have the solutions, having more people participate who are not on board with your ideas are going to keep those solutions from being implemented.
That's like a page right out of Paul Weyrich book, huh?
Yeah, like Paul Weyrich, I want the right. I don't want everyone voting. I just want the people voting. And I think here it's more explicit. When you read people, women shouldn't vote, or that women should only vote according to their what their husbands decide. Right now, I don't think this has much legs. I think we're going to be repealing a lot of amendments on January 21st, but the way in which these ideas are coming into circulation and are being heard, I think is a little bit scary, right? And I also don't think that people are going to give up rights, that they fought for very easily. Right? The idea of repealing the right for gays and lesbians to be married, right? The idea that we're going to repeal the right of women to vote, right? That these things are going to easy policy choices to implement. I think that's absurd. But the fact that they're getting these ideas are getting a hearing, the idea that smart people are making these arguments, I think that's something that we should be concerned about.
Yeah, how confident are you that our systems can prevent America from ever becoming a theocracy? And I don't probably mean that in the literal term, because I don't think that we'll be all forced to go to church or something like that, at least this year. It takes a couple of years for that stuff to kick in, but how confident are you that Supreme Court cases aren't going to all vote one way for religious freedom, as long as that religion is Christianity? Because I was thinking about this as we were talking. So I'm working to get Frederick Clarkson on the show, and he was the one that broke the story about Project Blitz. So he was like, "Hey, why are you interested?" And I was like, "Well, look around, all this stuff that's coming up. It's like textbook Project Blitz." And And it kind of scares me a little bit, and I'm a believer, but
Mhm.
I'm probably not the kind of believer that would go far, under the society. So give me your future pontifications.
Yeah, so I don't like to prognosticate, but I'll say a couple of things that I think are the case right now, which is we're a country of over 325 million people, and that there's a lot of religions, and there are people who have no religion or who have multiple religions, or switch. But the idea that there's going to be one church or one, right, sort of a national church, is absurd. Like it will not. Even if we talk about Christianity, right? Who's Christianity, right? So the idea that we're going to become a theocracy, in the next 5 years, I don't, put a lot of credence in. But the way in which more religion can be participate or playing out in the public, in the public political space, I think that's plausible. I think that, the Supreme Court in recent decisions has endorsed that. I think that there's also, you mentioned textbooks. One of the ways, one of the things that people in the Christian right have been interested in is if you can't have the public schools, and you may actually, for ideological reasons, be suspicious of public schools to begin with, right? You want to have more sort of control and more resources for either homeschooling or Christian academies, right? So taking resources from sort of the public funds and using them for Christian schools, for parochial schools, for homeschooling, what have you. What does this mean as going forward? I don't know. One of the things I try to push at the end of the book is that Christians have very different ideas about what a Christian society would look like. And so Pashtuni has a very different understanding of what an American Christendom would look like than a Bozell. The Church of England loyalists back in the day had a very different understanding of what that Christian America would look like than did New England Congregationalists or Reformed Presbyterians. At some point, even though religious traditionalists might see themselves as co-belligerents in a culture war, when they start getting traction, when push comes to shove, they still will differ very strongly on certain fundamental issues. Right. So if we look at Bible reading, we see this even with the Ten Commandments being posted. Great, we're going to post the Ten Commandments. Well, what are the Ten Commandments? Right? Whose translation of the Ten Commandments? What order of the Ten Commandments? Well, there's significant disagreements within Christian churches about what are the Ten Commandments, right? Whose Bible are we going to read? The King James Bible? Are we going to read are we going to read a Catholic translation of the Bible? Are we going to read a Jewish translation of the Hebrew Bible? So once you start getting down to what policies will be implemented, what will be the prayer at school, right? What will be the teaching that would be endorsed? All of a sudden, these things get to be a lot more complicated and a lot harder to nail down.
Well, I believe in Oklahoma, it's like their purchase request or their purchase order had to spec out Trump's Bible. So, go Trump.
Yeah.
And by the way, you can buy $1,000 Trump Bible that has a signature in it.
For 10 easy payments of $99.99.
But the Trump Bible is a fascinating thing because the Trump Bible not only is the Trump Bible, and I think it may have been printed in China, but it had to include the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, right? So this idea that now, one of the things that I think is interesting about that is that, there's an American tradition to regard the Constitution as a divinely inspired document, as God had raised inspired men to put that together. And where that idea comes from, who was the first real proclaimer of this idea of the inspired Constitution?
No, I don't. No.
The prophet Joseph Smith Jr.
What? No way.
In a revelation in 1833.
There you go, dude.
Right. So this idea, And this idea that the American founders were kind of raised by God providentially, and that the Constitution itself has a kind of sacred status, has long been a Mormon idea. And there are certain parts of the book. I'd done a lot of research on the political theology of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they're a fascinating story because, in a way, they start off as kind of American heretics, and then become the most orthodox Americans, right? The ones who see the founding as a providential event. So there's there are a lot of interesting ways in which we can think about the question of religion and politics in America. And one of the interesting places to start is in the history of the Mormon Church and their understanding of the problem.
I mean, this is so interesting. We could go on for, hours. And one thing I'm thinking that I would love to ask you before we kind of close our time together is how does one make a determination between the visions that are offered to us? Like, and again, I just for the sake of argument, right? You might have genuine people that are thinking, hey, this is the best way forward for everybody. This is the most equitable, like in the end, like again, defining equitable. This is going to bring the most blessing. This is going to bring the most human flourishing, right? And you have obviously a very diverse country, which is one of the things, right, that you would say, why? Well, I mean, how are you going to have this one system you're going to try to fit everyone into? And yet everyone in this country brings their own vision of the good life, or every subgroup brings this vision of the good life, and has this idea of how the government might help or hinder that vision of the good life, right? You have, have an LGBTQ vision. I'm not trying I know that's being monolithic, but for the sake of, just time, like you have that kind of vision. You have the evangelical Christian vision. You have a Jewish vision. You might have a Muslim vision. You have these visions, right? And then you have this reality of how everyone's trying to work this out. How can we approach these? Like if I'm sitting there and my, like, let's say my mom starts talking about, some idea, and it sounds a lot like something that Rush Dooney or Gary North would have said, but I know that that's not necessarily what she means, but she doesn't see anything necessarily wrong with that, right? And at least not on its face. And I'm not saying my mom does. I'm just throwing that out as an example. I don't think she actually does. I'm just throwing it out as an example. How do you, what advice do you have for starting to think critically about this, and not just like, well, that's bad because that seems un-American to me, or that seems wrong to me. But then the question, well, why is it wrong? Why is it un-American? Why is it?
That's a great question. I would say, I call the book American Heretics, not Un-American Heretics, because I think all the people I'm talking about are deeply American, even if they don't like America. So I would begin to answer your question by saying my understanding of liberal democracy is that it is a fundamentally non-utopian way of organizing a political life, civic life. In other words, liberal democracy is not about creating the perfect system, the perfect order. It's not messianic. And a lot of the people that I talk about are messianic. They believe that we can achieve some correspondence in heaven and earth. Liberal democracies, I understand, is kind of like, human beings are problematic animals or problematic creatures, and we can't accept to be saved through the state. We can create a state that will allow us to flourish as we understand it. And here I appeal to the language of Jefferson, that one of the rights that Jefferson believed that human beings have that are or endowed is the right to the pursuit of happiness. Not the right to happiness, but the right to the pursuit of happiness. That the liberal
Right.
democracy, right? That this provides a frame where people with very different ideas of what their happiness is can pursue it, and it means we're going to rub up against each other. It means we're going to bump into each other. We're not going to, it means we're going to get angry with each other and think each other's wrong or what have you. But by maybe taking the temperature down of what we can achieve in politics, we can pursue those ends, we can pursue our happiness with less violent conflict than might pertain in other systems. So, again, I guess my response is like maybe politically curb our enthusiasm a bit. But this allows for those experiments to happen. The reason why Mormonism was able to emerge in the United States and flourish was, as they knew, because of the First Amendment. Right? Joseph Smith believed that the Constitution was providential because it created the space. Religious liberty created the space for this to happen. Now, a lot of people might say, well, that was a terrible thing to happen. But a lot of people might say, well, actually, this is what's amazing about America, that something like Mormonism could happen, or something like the Pentecostalist movement can happen, something like the Church of Martin Luther King Jr. mentioned earlier, that can happen, as well as Rushduni. This all can happen. No one is able to achieve their ends completely or their vision completely, but we have these different communities that can coexist with one another, and that, I think, is a great achievement. So that's why I am sort of end the book with a call to recognize the fragility of liberal democracy, but also the benefits, the blessings that liberal democracy has to offer.
Well, that's great. I think that was really well said, and I appreciate that, Jerome. How can people follow your work and connect with you and what you're doing?
Yeah, you can look at we have a page at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace and Global Affairs at Georgetown University, so you can check me out there, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to chat again. This has been wonderful.
Well, thank you so much, Jerome, for coming on the show and spending some time sharing your ideas with us in your book.
Thanks for the great work you do.
Thank you. We couldn't do it without guys like you that are doing some of that other heavy lifting, and we can have these conversations. So we just love it. And to our audience, thank you guys for joining us. Make sure you like and subscribe if you're on YouTube following us. That would be great. Share this with someone that you think needs it. Man, we really try to put our heart and soul into these episodes to give you good content that you can think about. It's thought-provoking, and I think today has been just as much of an example of that as any. And we just want you guys to be blessed by this and to be challenged by it, in whatever way that works for you. And so thank you for following us and being here with us and sticking with us to the end of this conversation. And until next time, guys, keep your conversations not right or left, but up, and we'll see you then.